Welcome to my Bass Harbor Headlight transparent watercolor tutorial. This is a narrated step-by-step tutorial where I'll walk through the development of this painting at normal speed. I will also talk about some of the equipment I use and review the palette I used for this painting. This is the companion video to my Bass Harbor Headlight transparent watercolor demonstration video, which is set to music at 3x speed so you can watch the evolution of the painting uninterrupted. Before I begin to paint, I have made a decision that I'm going to use masking fluid to protect the white of the paper and some of the highlight areas. To do this, I'm going to use this fine line masking fluid pen. These are the paint brushes I use for this painting. Starting from the bottom, I have a 1.5 inch wash brush, which is a silver black velvet brush, and the brush right above it is also a silver black velvet brush, and it's called a Jumbo Round Small. The brush above that is an Escoda Reserva. I have a number of Escoda Reserva brushes, and they're a good all-purpose brush. And the brush at the very top is a black gold quill series. It's a 311 is the number for the series, and it isn't a small brush, but it comes to a very fine point, and it's very good for detail work. You'll notice me spraying with a fine mist spray bottle throughout this video, and this is the bottle I use, made by Atelier. It's a very fine mist water sprayer. It's designed for use for their acrylics, but it's excellent for watercolors. I find it does a nice job of softening edges and diffusing the color across the painting. This is my palette, and I've indicated the colors that I use for this particular painting. So starting with the right, cerulean blue, above that royal blue, a very dark blue, going over at the top, quinacridone coral, pyrrole red, and down the side Halloween orange, quinacridone gold, and sap green. In this particular painting, I achieved my greens by using a mixture of sap green, pyrrole red, and royal blue. Those three colors in various mixtures are what I use to develop my greens. The quinacridone coral and quinacridone gold I use to mix together, and I come up with a burnt sienna type tone, and I darken that and then drive a little bit towards neutral with either a cerulean or a royal blue. And the sky is achieved using royal blue and cerulean blue with a touch of Halloween orange to drive it more towards neutral. To the right is the reference photograph that I used for this painting. This is my sketch that I drew using the reference photo. Before I begin painting, I'm going to prepare the surface, and I'm going to use this fine line masking fluid pen. I'm going to touch on some of the highlight areas that I want to preserve the white of the paper. So I begin putting some of this masking fluid on some of the highlight areas that I want to protect on the top of the lighthouse. I'm going to come in with a big wash, and I want to preserve those elements on the lighthouse, keeping them the whitest whites. I'm masking just the edge of the main section of the lighthouse. That'll allow me just to use a big wash and keep a nice clean edge there, but I didn't feel the need that I had to mask the whole thing. I'm also masking some of the cross pieces on the window, and I can come in with just a dark tone and lay it over top, and then when I lift that off, it'll retain the white crossbars, cross members of the window. I've touched masking fluid on some of the highlight areas of the rocky shoreline, and now I'm going to take a jar of masking fluid and a toothbrush. I'm going to dip it in there and splatter it on the surface in some of the areas where I want to create some texture. And now I've prepared the surface, I'm ready to begin painting, and I'm going to start putting in a large wash in the sky with a 1.5 inch flat wash brush. This color is a mixture of royal blue with some Halloween orange, and then I'll be coming back in, I'll be using a little bit of cerulean in it. But the Halloween orange makes it more of a neutral tone. You'll notice that I'm not noodling away with a small brush on this sky. These are big, bold, wet strokes, wet on wet, and I touch it here and there with a little bit more color or tone, just a touch darker value, and then I leave it alone, and I try to keep it fresh. This sky will be pretty much just painted with this 1.5 inch flat brush. You don't need to really do any small brush work. You can get a nice effect just applying the light fluid wash. And you can see even as I'm painting where the ocean is and starting to create that horizon line, I'm just using big bold strokes and laying them down. Now I'm going to start to lay in the line of pine trees which are on the top of that rocky ledge, and this isn't going to be painted limb by limb, and I'm not going to try and detail out each tree. I'm trying to paint a dark shape there that's going down the edge of the rocky cliff there. While I am trying to indicate that there's individual trees there, it's pretty much one dark shape, and that's how I'm approaching it. It just suggests that there's pine trees there. Now this is a mixture of sap green and pyrrole red with maybe just a touch of royal blue in it, but for the most part it's sap green, and the pyrrole red neutralizes a little bit, takes the rawness off the color. With the exception of the large wash brush, you see that I'm using a series of round brushes. Now, what I'm doing here, there's many people that would do with a flat brush. They're quite skilled using the corners and the edge of the flat brush, and you can use those also to make very nice pine trees. I just tend to favor the round brushes most often. One thing I want to point out is really nowhere am I taking my paintbrush loaded with pigment and just really noodling away at a detailed area. I'm trying to let the watercolor be watercolor, let it flow, let it mix on the paper, not just in the palette, let some of the colors mingle. You can see there's a touch of a gold color in there, charging the green area. So I try to keep it fresh, as I said before. Put that bold stroke down and just leave it. Now keep in mind that the tones that I've laid down so far, and or start talking values, I really haven't put down any dark values. I mean, these are still pretty much in the mid-tone, and remember that when your paint dries, it's going to be lighter than it appears when it's wet. So right now, there's a series of pine trees here that are closer, they're larger, and I still view them as a large shape. What I normally do is I lay down a series of light to middle value washes, and then I start to come in with darker values and gradually build those values across the whole composition. And I generally start focusing around my center of interest. Now, there's some people that will begin with their darkest darks first, and then come in with middle value and lighter tones after that. So you have to just tailor what fits you and what you feel comfortable with. There's a lot of different ways to approach painting with watercolor. That's where I point out that if you like to work with flat brushes, work with flat brushes. If you like to work with round brushes, work with round brushes. Try some different things. But in the end, you really can't just copy everything somebody does. You just have to take bits and pieces and use what works for you. I'm laying a darker, cooler tone on top of what I had there. And remember that I have splattered some masking fluid there with the toothbrush. And when I lift that off, that's going to present some of the texture there that I've preserved. Now I'm going to begin working some of this rocky cliff area, and I'm starting with a mixture of quinacridone coral and quinacridone gold. It makes a burnt sienna tone, and you can see that I'm just taking just simple brush strokes. I'm laying them down with some conviction and trying to indicate the different surfaces of the rocky cliff there. And just the direction of the stroke helps give validity to that surface area. Now I'm starting to work with a cooler tone, and this is the mixture of quinacridone coral and quinacridone gold, but I've put a touch of royal blue in there to move it towards neutral, and it's a much cooler color. So I'm trying to indicate the changes in this rocky surface by using warm and cool colors. I'll use darker and lighter values, and I'll use the direction of my brush strokes. Use all three of those things in combination to make this rocky cliff believable. Now I'm working to indicate the lower shoreline there below the cliff. It's kind of a green, mossy, rocky area. And I'm not going to overwork this area. I'm going to lay some tone down. And this is a mixture of sap green, pyrrole red, and royal blue. Same as what I've used in the trees, but I've left it more towards the neutral side. And now that I've applied the paint, I'm coming in with my fine mist sprayer that I like to use, and I'm softening those edges. And I'm not going to do much more to this lower shoreline. It gives the appearance of the surf coming in on it. It's a little bit of misting above it, and there's no need to overwork it. Now I'm going to work to put a darker value on these pine trees that are more in the foreground, and give them a little bit more of a sharper edge. You'll notice that as I'm applying these darker values, I'm just putting in brush strokes and not overworking any particular area. I lay the brush stroke down, leave it alone. Some areas where I want to soften the edge a little bit, I come in with my fine mist sprayer. And after I spray that mist, it does leave a little bit of a wet surface, and you can work a little wet in wet, which gives a nice effect in some areas. Keep in mind that I do have a photograph that I was using for reference for this painting. I used it to draw my sketch at the beginning, and I've used it as reference as I've started to develop this, but I'm not looking at it with regularity at this point. I still look at it and glance at it for some reference, but a lot of this is just shape making and laying in values and trying to design and make a painting. My intent is to make it be representative of the photograph, but it's not a photographic representation. I'm not trying to just recreate the photograph. I'm still trying to make it painterly and make a piece of art. I'm coming back in with just a touch deeper value in the sky. I decided I want a little bit more value contrast there, a little bit more drama, make it a little bit more interesting. Now I want to indicate the horizon line, make it stand out a little bit more, and I'm pretty much done. I've come in, I've laid in just some bold strokes, soften a little bit of the edge with my sprayer, and I'm going to leave it. And that is just enough to suggest that the horizon's there, and that the ocean's there, and that there's a change from there in the sky. Now I'm applying a dark tone in this window shape, and I had put the masking fluid there to indicate some of the sections of the window, and so I've done enough there, and I've dried it, and now I'm going to come back and I'm going to remove this masking fluid using a rubber cement pickup eraser, and you'll start to see the highlights that I've preserved with the masking fluid start to reveal themselves. And the white shape of that lighthouse really starts to stand out against that somewhat neutral sky there. I'm going to start to do some work on the lighthouse shape now that I remove all the masking fluid. And you'll see that it's not really detailed work that I'm doing here. I'm touching some cool value here right now, a cool tone, and it's going to indicate the shaded side of that building. And but when I'm done here, I'm not going to have rendered this lighthouse. I'm just putting in some tone, laying in some values to define the various shapes. But the whole shape of the lighthouse is somewhat painted by the negative sky shape behind it. And really here, I'm just continuing to lay touches of value and a cool value, cool tone. And it starts to make this lighthouse look more like a lighthouse. But again, the negative area behind and beside it with the trees and the sky behind it, that's what really starts to make this lighthouse believable. It's not the brushwork that I've done on the lighthouse. Now, as I work around the top of this, there's definitely some positive painting that needs to occur. I'm going to have to actually paint on the lighthouse, but the majority of the shape and the character that the lighthouse is coming from the negative painting of the space around it. I'm using a dark mixture here that is royal blue with Halloween orange in it. Drive it towards neutral. It still has a blue tint to it, but I don't have any blacks on my palette. I mix all my neutral, gray, black tones that I work with. The value that I'm using here on the top of this lighthouse is the darkest value that I've applied so far. And sometimes people reach the values that I have on the trees and think they've really put down a dark value, and really that's just a mid-tone, a middle value. It doesn't hurt sometimes to have a card handy where you have your a grayscale ranging from a white to a light to a middle value into your darkest dark, and you can use that to hold up against your painting and really ask yourself, have I really gone as dark as I can with this painting? And I think a lot of times what prevents a painting from really standing out is we don't go as dark as we can with our values. You're more likely to have a painting that's not as successful because of poor value contrast than you are related to the colors that you're using. Remember also that your position of your dark values is going to influence how dark those colors or those values feel. When you put a dark value next to a whiter light, it's going to stand out and appear very dark, and it's not going to have the same contrast obviously when you put it next to a middle value. Another thing you want to remember as I work on this lighthouse here is you want to have a dominance. As you're designing your painting, or even in your sketch, where you develop a value sketch, if you're using a value sketch, you want to have a dominance. So you have a light, middle value, or dark. You don't want equal of each. You want to vary that, and this painting here is going to be middle value is going to be dominant, and there's going to be light areas, light shapes, predominantly that White House and some of the rocks, and then there's going to be some dark values brought in, but you can very well have a painting where the dark values are dominant, or the dark shapes, but you tend to, whether it's value or color, you want to have some type of a dominant prevalent, whether it's color or you're talking value. So the tone that I'm applying there, that red, is a quinacridone coral with quinacridone gold and a touch of royal blue to tame it a little bit and make it not so raw. You'll notice one of the things that I do after I've applied a paint to an area, sometimes I'll come back and I'll hit it with a Kleenex, just as I am right there, and that, to me, it helps create some interest in the shape. It makes it also feel a little bit more natural to me, because surfaces aren't a solid block color. The light hits it, there's reflections, there's shadows, and just touching it with a Kleenex is an easy way to vary the tone and the shape and to give it some texture. As I begin to work on these, the rocks here of this cliff area, the direction of my brush strokes is going to be very important to making this believable as a rocky edge of a cliff as it cascades down to the lower shoreline. I'll point out again that I'm not rendering these rocks or this cliff. I'm laying down brush strokes and then moving on. I'm not overdoing it and overworking an area. I just make my statement with my brush and then go to the next area. And then I come in and I'll soften my edges a little bit using a spray bottle from time to time. But in order to make this believable as this sheer rocky edge, I'm using the brush stroke, I'm using the value contrast here. I'm starting to get darker with my values, and I continue to use warm and cool colors. The cool seemingly to recede and the warm to stand out. So there I'm softening a little bit more with the spray bottle. To me, this again gives it a more natural feel. It keeps some of the edges hard and softens up others, and makes the eye make some of the decisions. I don't show the use of the hair dryer in my video. I edit that out, but I do stop and dry this paper frequently as I paint. I do a combination of wet on dry and wet into wet as I do this. Most of the wet on wet comes after I've used the spray bottle. I come in and I touch the paper with some pigment, but most of my layers are built painting wet on dry. And you'll also see through the video, you'll hit these moments where I've edited out the drying, and the paper will, the paint will get much lighter after I'm done drying it, and you'll see that transition in the video. And again, I'll point out that the paint dries much lighter than it does than it appears when it's wet. And you have to keep that in mind when you're trying to reach your darkest value. Sometimes you think you put down your darkest value, and after it's dry, it's not as near as dark as what you believed it was going to be. As I continue to work on these rocks, I'll try to vary the shapes, the size of the shapes that I'm painting. I'm laying this tone down in a larger shape than I have so far. You want to vary the size of the rocks. You don't want everything to be the same size. It's not near as interesting or strong composition, and it's generally not how things occur. The same thing with trees. When you're working with trees, you don't want every tree the same height. You don't want every tree to be spaced equally from one tree to the next. If you're painting the woods, you want to vary the distance between them. Again, you want to have variability that just makes for a more interesting composition. So these shapes are various sizes, and I change the angles of them just as a rocky edge would be. I'm going to apply a little bit of this tone up into the trees, carries it through my composition. One of the things I'll point out as you hear me talk, and I'm talking about shapes, and I'm talking about dominance and laying down brush strokes, what's driving me is the design, overall design of the painting, not my reference material. I'm not trying to copy every little increment of value or color that's in my photograph. I'm still trying to make a painting, so I'm trying to use design principles to guide me as I work my way through this, accomplishing this painting. You hear me talking about shapes and value and contrast and brush strokes, and keep in mind, right now my approach is I'm trying to make a painting. And if you're, say, doing a botanical and you're trying to make an accurate representation of a plant life or a fruit or a vegetable or an animal, your approach could be much different. Not that you're not concerned with composition, but your main focus is probably the accuracy and the accurate representation of what you're painting. And I'm not trying to, again, recreate a photograph. I'm trying to keep this painterly. I want it to be representative of my subject matter, but I'm still trying to make my decisions based on design principles, not so much guiding and reproducing what was captured by the camera. As the artist, we have the ability to make decisions that the camera can't make. We can omit things or add things, or understate areas that we prefer not to have in our painting. And again, that's part of the fun of painting and why we do this. I have done these types of paintings where I take a piece of illustration board and my photo, and I sit there for 10 hours trying to recreate the photo. I haven't done that for some time. I really don't enjoy painting that way anymore. But if that's the type of painting that you want to do, that's fine. If that's what you enjoy and that's your objective, then that's what you should do. To me, painting that way defeats the reason for working with transparent watercolor, which is what I prefer to work with. I have no opaque paints. I rely on the white of the paper. And so to sit down and do a rendering of a photograph in watercolor is just not something that I really care to do or get much enjoyment out of. It prevent you from really benefiting from what watercolor is and what it can do. And you might as well just sit down with some gouache or acrylics and just do your illustration basically. As I said, I work with transparent watercolor, and I have 30 colors on my palette. However, there's 8 to 10 that I use most frequently, and I work on watercolor paper. My paper of choice has been for some time has been Lighthouse. It's 140-pound cold press. I don't seem to have the need to use 300-pound. The 140 does a good job for me. I use a hair dryer and I dry it frequently in my painting process. And I like the whiteness of Lighthouse, and it still has the ability to do some lifting, some moderate lifting. And I've been very pleased with that as a work surface. And working with watercolor or any artist grade materials can get a little pricey. And for me, one of the things that I think is important is to have a good work surface. If you're going to prioritize where to spend money, I think having good paper to work on in watercolor is important. Not saying you can't do painting on just about anything, but I really think that to fully explore watercolor, you have to be working on a good work surface. I would also say work on a size that you feel comfortable with. For the longest time, just about every painting I did was on a full sheet of watercolor paper. That's just what I was in a mode to do. But I find myself now doing a lot of quarter sheet watercolors, sometimes half sheets. But for the most part, I work on quarter sheet or full sheet watercolors. And if you're concerned about paper and the cost of paper, it's tough to go out there and lay down a $10 sheet of watercolor paper, and you're so afraid you're gonna to make a mistake and ruin your sheet of paper that it inhibits the painting process. So to that, I would say just work smaller and get a little bit more mileage out of your investment. I've reached a point here where I'm moving about the composition, putting in some darker values, just some little accents to give just an element of detail to the painting, and it helps make some areas stand out a little bit more just by going around and put it in these little finishing details. And I'll do this whether it's a landscape or a floral type of a composition, and that's kind of my painting process. I begin with a wash, often in the middle values, and then I start building up my values and my level of detail. And depending on the type of painting I'm doing, I'll come in and I'll put some really strong areas of contrast near some of my whitest whites or lightest lights to really make things start to pop. And I've decided here that I still want a little bit darker value in the foreground here on these trees. They're closer, they're going to be a little crisper. I had put a few touches of value down on that lower shoreline, and I did that not because I looked at my photo and said, oh, there's a darker value there. I did it because I felt the composition needed it. It just gave a little bit more depth and dimension to that lower shoreline. And just as I come in with some darker values towards the end of my painting process to give a finishing touch, I also sometimes come in with a wash. In this case, I'm coming in with a warm wash to try and bring some of those surfaces forward and send some of the cooler areas back. And there are times when I'll come in with just a glaze and go over various areas of the painting just to tie it together and send some areas back and give them make it more of a resting place for the eye, and in turn it brings other areas forward. So I've lightly sketched in some gull shapes here. I know people are going to say, oh my gosh, that makes it trite, but to me these gull shapes here help make the lighthouse on this rocky cliff a little bit more believable. It positions that lighthouse high up on that cliff with these birds flying below it. And as I put these birds out here, I've tried to suggest some directional changes to help draw the eye around the composition. It's not just 3 V's drawn in the sky. I've varied the shapes and the directions that the birds are flying, and they're at different altitudes. So this is what you see when you're on the coastline. So it wasn't in my photograph, but I took my artistic license to make that decision. And that's my painting Bass Harbor Head Like. I hope you've got some value out of watching this video, and you can watch my companion demonstration if you want to see this evolution, the evolution of this painting uninterrupted. Thanks for watching.